Wow, thanks. That was lovely. Thank you very much. Oh, hey. So, no, it's just seeing familiar faces. So, I have a few places I'm gonna read. I'm not gonna read just one thing all the way through. So it is a book about my little brother and me. And it first started after I discovered that my novel didn't work anymore. And so I was gonna read just this first page real quick, because it shows this is literally the first part of the book that I read, or that I wrote, sitting in like a Barnes & Noble between classes because I didn't have an office. And so here it is, just a flesh wound. When I was maybe 11, I walked into the bathroom and burned a piece of skin off the back of my hand on a curling iron. My aunt had left it plugged in for hours. It was hanging off the edge of the sink, waist high, and when I made contact, the first layer of skin peeled away, leaving an indent the size and shape of a kidney bean. I thought it was okay at first. At least, I don't remember when it started to hurt, if it came with the shock of seeing a piece of my epidermis melted off, or if it was when I when I put it under cold water. I know it hurt when I applied the toothpaste. Yeah. A neighbor had once told me it soothed burns. I had a hard time scrubbing the toothpaste out from the melted flesh. Yeah, true story. It burned mint fresh for days. I didn't let anyone see how bad it really was. My parents asked if I was okay. They scolded me on paying more attention and told me not to ever listen to irrational medical advice from stupid neighbors. They asked if I needed to see a doctor. Gripping my hand, careful not to put any weight into the paste-filled concave, I said, "No, it was fine, I was fine." I didn't show it to any adults until after it healed over. It seared red and infected around what had become a black scab mixed with fragments of white paste. It lasted days, weeks, longer. I hid it under a Band-Aid and eventually it healed. Now I have a smooth oblong scar between the bottom knuckle of my right index finger and thumb. And it's okay, I'm okay. There's nothing on my skin that shows where I was hit by a car and then abandoned while walking across the street in Rancho Mirage, California when I was 33. I have no scar. I wasn't hurt. With no definitive proof of the incident, I'm not sure what to say. How can anything be important if it doesn't leave a mark? So that's kind of what I started with, and it went from there, but I was writing this book and, talking with my little brother who was in prison in Tucson, and we used to talk every day. He called me twice a day. And for those of us who have people in prison, which is everybody, all of us, they can only hit you up twice a day. And so I was trying to get stories from him. And so this little section is about that. It's Ghost Like Satin. Mike was alive when I began writing this book. It was supposed to be about the two of us, the fucked up adventures, the Martinez bros. So I asked him about stories, wanting to get down everything he wanted and needed to contribute. It was so important to me to hear from him, what he wanted to say. It was hard for him to write toward the end. While in prison, he had his phone rights taken away after getting in trouble a couple of times. They were all issued tablets, and the one Mike wrote with was low quality and hard to type on. So I would ask specific questions and see what he was able to answer. When I asked about our late nights in Puerto Rico as children, he wrote, "Yeah, dude, I remember that, dude. But hanging out all night always reminds me of the hurricane and everyone being up all night drinking and smoking. Yeah, good times. LOL. Let me know if you're still up, dude. Love you, Mike." It was late, but I was still up. For him, I would always try to stay up, though that didn't always happen. While we had to pay for each email we sent, it was quicker than letters. He liked when we were able to talk to each other at the same time. "It's like we're texting," he would say, and that would break my heart. I tried to stay awake, but the messages would get blocked by guards sometimes or would just take too long to come, and it was expensive. Our texting conversations never lasted long, even if we did send at least one short message a day to one another. I had to take Mike's scant comments and paint the pictures to match his words myself. The hurricane, staying up, hanging out. Nights in Puerto Rico were warm and salty. When we think of them in fragments, wandering in the dark through the smell of tropical plants and our neighbor's laundry detergent, nights in the park surrounded by drunk girls and their boyfriends, our friends and girlfriends, the people we loved. Stumbling through the basketball court and bleachers, the storm had torn the metal roof off of those bleachers and sent it bouncing down the street like a crumpled ball of tinfoil. After the hurricane, the air stopped. We would leave our parents sleeping and sit out in the 4 a.m. stillness. Saha would rest her back on my folded legs, her spine eaten into my knee. Angel did magic tricks, guessing the cards we'd picked each time, while the next-door neighbor stared at him in love. Mike Pena told stories about his old buddies killed off in gang wars. The girls across the street shined flashlights in our faces and giggled if we walked too close to their house. I saw a ghost once, Jasmine said. She'd broken up with me, but she still hung around, her hair sometimes orange, sometimes blue. She often brought a girlfriend with her, but never another boyfriend. Mike gave a half chuckle. He couldn't tell if she was joking. Neither could I. It didn't matter. We were all buzzed and in love with the peaceful isolation of living in the middle of the night with no electricity at a time and place in which no disaster mattered. We were kids. Jasmine and Saha were 15, Mike Pena and I about 14. Mike was 11, always the youngest among us. Angel was maybe 17, the neighbor girl who was in love with him about 15. We were in front of Saha's house or in the park with other friends whose names and faces I no longer remember, though I dream of them sometimes. Jasmine pushed her orange hair out of her face and looked at the dark across the street, serious. I did, she said. It hung there in the air for a while. I got a good look. It wasn't like one of those eye trick things. Mike and I stared at her, and in this memory, he's in more of a shadow than the rest of us. He scratched his head. Oh. I followed her gaze into the dark. It looked like my grandma, she said, but like all in white, like white satin. And in the dark, I thought I saw a wisp of light, blurred, almost real, like this memory is a blurred wisp, like the deepest pole in my chest when I remember Mike, though I can't see him as well as I used to. There's not a single person in that group I'm still in contact with. For all I know, I'm the only one left with these images in my head, these blips I'm afraid to lose. How much is already lost? The moments in which we sat quiet, listening to the night air, to the coquilles, to the sound of card tricks and stories about ghosts. When Mike died, everything he knew that I didn't was lost. And when we're both gone, who will still see us, believe we existed? So, just to give like an air of my little brother. And I love that guy. He was everything to me. And so from there I decided, I thought I'd read a little bit about my experiences here at ASU. They're intense. So when I was here at ASU as an undergrad, like I was still having mad problems. So my little brother and I, we had horrific drug abuse issues growing up. And when I was in school here, I still had a pretty bad opioid problem. And so that figures into this. So just so you know. So this is in the chapter Education 2. In the summer, I worked at the Multicultural Center on campus and interned at Hayden's Ferry Review, ASU's literary magazine. The magazine was run out of an old house called the Piper Center, which the campus had grown around, yeah. Oh yeah, okay. It was said that Robert Frost had stayed there on his trips to Arizona. The magazine was run from offices upstairs. Downstairs was a dining room, living room, kitchen, and bathroom, all lined with books. During the school year, MFA students and undergrads filtered in and out, lounging on the couch, eating packed lunches in the dining room, making coffee in the kitchen. But in the summer, it was mostly staff and me. I didn't want to go home if I didn't have to. Veronica's my wife. Veronica and I were couch surfing between family friends and my uncle's house, and my marriage was getting so tense because of my hidden drug use that it was getting hard to breathe. At the Piper Center in Hayden's Ferry Review, I could pretend to be literary, pretend my addictions were a sign of genius rather than a desperate attempt at survival. I pretended to be the same as every other student and writer who came in. I didn't want their lives, I wanted my own, but I wanted mine to be moving forward like theirs seemed to. One day I was at the Piper Center after scoring some black tar heroin from a panhandling couple across the street. She had a 7-month pregnant belly, and he was a short man with waist-length hair and a sign that stated they needed sandwiches. I'd also just gotten my hands on a clean, still packaged syringe. I hadn't shot up for a while to avoid track marks. I was familiar with powder heroin, because in Florida that's what you had most, smoking black and a variety of pills, but this was the first time I was going to try shooting black tar. I walked up the stairs, talked with the editor about an idea I had for the blog. We joked for a minute before I let her get back to work. I made my way back downstairs to the small bathroom between the kitchen where I grabbed a spoon and the lounge area. And I I locked the door and took out my supplies. Without thinking, I made a mix of all the paste in my tiny baggie, tied off, and let the warm rush flow up my left arm to my brain and plow me over. I realized something was wrong almost immediately. My head sank, and I barely made it to the bowl as I started throwing up. It was a single-occupancy bathroom, like in a regular house, with one toilet, which I flushed a couple of times to get the smell out. My breathing slowed. I couldn't get off the floor. All I could do for at least half an hour was lay my face against the tile, hoping it wasn't in dried piss, and tell myself I had to stay awake. The electronic lock on the bathroom door would unlock every few minutes. I had to keep hitting the button to keep it locked, which at least gave me something to do while I struggled to stay conscious. I was sick and terrified. I don't want to die under this toilet, I thought. This is stupid. I'm so fucking stupid. After having to lock the door 5 or 6 times, I tried to get out. It was only a matter of time before someone from upstairs would have to use the bathroom. Kneeling, I opened the door, looked around, and saw the living room was empty. Perfect. I knew that if I stood up, I'd throw up again and probably pass out, so I crawled to the nearby couch. I don't remember what happened over the next few hours, but I stayed awake with the help of mental images of myself dying and the police having to call Veronica while she was at work, cleaning one of my relatives' homes so that we could make our car payment. I was ashamed of everything about myself. The HFR people were going to find me passed out or dead on their couch. I was going to get kicked out of school. Eventually, I got up and stumbled into the 120-degree Phoenix sun. The point of my arm where the needle had gone in was almost imperceptible, but I could see it. I hated it. I walked over to the first rough palm tree I could find and scraped my arm against it, tearing at the skin, wanting to erase me. I promised myself I'd never get high again. I knew I was lying. While I was on the bathroom floor, Mike was on the other side of Phoenix, buying and selling pills at the back of the burger place where he worked, drinking in the pub next door after he got off. I would go into the restaurant every time I could, and he would grin and say to all his coworkers, "Yo, this is my big brother. He's the guy I was telling you about." After I overdosed in the bathroom, I decided to go to the campus doctor's office. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. He didn't treat addiction problems. I should go to a rehab. "I can't go to a rehab," I explained, on the bench in his office. I couldn't drop out in the middle of a semester, and if my wife found out I was back on drugs, she would leave me. Also, there was no way I could afford it. "If you don't quit, you probably won't graduate. The addiction is more likely to end your marriage than rehab. It's more likely to end your life." "Fuck that rehab shit," Mike said when I recounted the conversation for him as we sat at a booth a few days later. He was in his smock and cap, drinking Dr. Pepper like he always did. "Fuck that doctor wouldn't even, help you. You got this shit, brother. Look at you doing all this college shit. You're good, man. You get through it like you always do. I'm fucking proud of you, man." It'd be a couple months before he quit his job and started slinging black full time. As I finished my BA, with honors, despite the doctor's warning, I have no idea how that happened, I snuck away from home and school to hang out with Mike. Somehow everything felt like saudade, even as we were moving through those years, as if we knew unconsciously that moving at that velocity could never last. Something had to break. Something had to end. Either my schooling or writing or marriage or drug use or all of it would end. It had to. Either Mike would get off drugs, stop selling, or he would go to prison or die. We knew these were our options. We were well aware of the dangers, but it felt like we were watching ourselves act out our lives, unable to understand that we were indeed capable of changing course. While we waited for whatever was to come, we hid in cars in the back of rough parking lots with faded lines and cooked crushed pills and water on spoons. We smoked black tar chasing trails as they dripped down the tinfoil, pulling on the bitter smoke through cut straws melted at the edges that were always too close to the heat. Smoke so strong that the first toke of the day, after the sickness had begun to creep in, would always make me dry heave. Or we would sit on the floor of Mike's apartment and talk as much as we could in the few minutes I stole between classes before flying the 40 minutes back to campus to sit in on a Shakespeare lecture or creative writing workshop. I wrote essays and short stories late into the night to get everything turned in on time. I stayed with my wife in the campus library past midnight, working while fingering the oxymorphone tablets or packets of Suboxone sublinguals in my pocket. I wasn't as bad as I'd been in Florida, I'd say to myself. I was using every day, yeah, but it wasn't like I was shooting up every day like before. Only some days, and it was always a clean rigs this time. I didn't nod off as much and as I used to because I was trying to manage more than get high. Just enough to function, I would tell myself, not knowing at the time that it was my mental health I needed to manage instead of the opioids. No coke, and I never banged meth. My rules were flimsy and never took much to break, but they were all I had. During those stolen moments, Mike was earnest, telling me about the money he was making selling, or TVs people had given him in lieu of cash, though the one TV he had was cracked in the corner where the color flickered and bled. We're like more than brothers, Mike would say. I would agree. At Mike's, I could breathe, could stop pretending to be the student and husband and person everyone wanted me to be, who I wanted to be but couldn't. He didn't want me to be anything other than what I was. There was a comfort in him, an acknowledgement that everything was fucked, but we still had one another. Mike was a wild constant, and that would never change. One afternoon, junk sick, I was walking to the light rail with a classmate from ASU, a skinny guy who always wore flannel and was obsessed with David Foster Wallace. He seemed constantly worried about not appearing bland. He hung out with the other creative writing classmates in bars after class. I didn't. Sweaty, oily, with goose flesh and chills raising on my skin, I stopped outside a corner bar before we crossed the street. I don't remember what we were talking about or why I said it, but I leaned my head against a pole and said, I wake up in pain every day, man. Miserable every day. He looked at me, half rolled his eyes, smiled, and said, is that really true? That's so cliche. Yeah. All he knew about me was that I was in his writing classes and he'd seen me floating around writing conferences and readings. He'd read some of my stories about drugs and mental health issues, and for some reason I thought that would have made a difference. But I knew, the way I'd always known, that no, like most normal people, he would never know what I'd said was true. I felt stupid for saying anything. I ignored his comment, and he allowed the conversation to go in another direction. When we parted, I made my way over to the light rail alone. I carefully crossed the street, trying not to shit myself, and sat on the baking metal bench with the desert sun on my shoulders. While I waited for the train, I leaned over my knees and rocked back and forth. I hadn't lied to my classmate. I woke up junk sick most days, feeling greasy. If I ever was feeling well, I knew it wouldn't last, so I set off in search to find something quick to keep me high. If I was in one of my periods in which I wasn't using, I would still wake up nervous or unable to see reality, unable to go to work, and never really sure why. I was probably lazy or melodramatic. What I'd said was the truth, but all it took was one comment, one accusation of being cliche to make me feel like everything I knew was actually an exaggeration. Asshole, I thought, trying to fight the idea that maybe he was right. There's reasons cliches exist. My dreams had merged. My love of books and my need for drugs, or the dream and nightmare, were fighting one another. It was wonderful and horrible, but being with Mike made it beautiful too. I wrote essays upon essays and stories upon stories for my college classes that I got good grades on and published in the school literary magazines. At least in Mike's grungy apartment on a side of town that would have terrified most people I went to school with, I wasn't in danger of running into a basic David Foster Wallace bro. No one could tell me I was cliche as Mike and I switched to Spanish to talk to the Mexican woman who ran a mini market out of her one-bedroom apartment in his complex, or when we argued and laughed in a mix of English, Spanish, and Portuguese in the QT, drawing the attention of everyone around us. Maybe I was a cliche, walking proof of the epidemic spreading through the U.S., the perfect student who almost kills himself in a bathroom where Robert Frost once took a shit. The loving lion husband, the guy who gets arrested the day after graduating with honors and instead of celebrating spends 3 days in Miami-Dade Correctional, sure at the time that his marriage and life were over. So my marriage isn't over. I'm still very happily married, very, very gratefully. So I thought I'd end on a lighter one, but also ASU. So, the preacher. I don't know if he's still here. The guy that used to like. No, he's not here anymore. But you know who I'm talking about. Okay, so this is him. So, the preacher. There was a preacher who would stand close to the Arizona State University Library. He was neatly dressed, tall, always in aviators, and from morning to night, he and his followers handed out pamphlets and sermonized nonstop under a tall yellow sign that read, "Fornicators, adulterers, masturbators, homosexuals, murderers, hell." If you missed it, I'm sorry. He would preach hellfire into his microphone, voice emanating from the small amplifier at his side, while the crowd gathered around him to argue and watch the spectacle. The preacher never yelled. He was loud, he was offensive, he liked to egg people on, like making students who gathered around him angry, making them engage with him, but he never yelled, opting instead to keep a smug, serene, holy smile on his face. I never interacted with the guy and always made a wide path around his disciples to avoid being inundated with flyers and cards and advertisements for church that I would have had to dodge. I was a junior, and while I had a 3.8 GPA, I was still getting fired from most jobs, was back on drugs, and feeling out of place as a student. My previous university experience was working landscaping and irrigation at the University of Central Florida, where the Mexican workers and I would make fun of the rich kids in Spanish as we saw them in their fancy cars while we did lines of Coke and drank beer on our lunch break, caked in dirt and sweat. By the time I had moved away from Florida and was attending ASU, Mike was living on the other side of Phoenix, but had taken the light rail to go see some concert and stop by the ASU campus to hang out with me for a few hours. He was on the way and he had time to kill. I skipped my classes and walked around with him, laughing and talking nonstop like we always did. We were retelling some story about ourselves to each other as we came out of the library. That was when Mike saw the preacher in his sign. He stopped mid-sentence, looked up at the pastor, who was standing on the bench arguing with irate passers-by, raised his hands to his mouth and yelled as loud as he could over the pastor's amplified voice, "Woot woot, masturbators!" We continued casually away as the crowd stopped arguing and started laughing. That was the only time I ever saw that preacher falter. So there we go.